Good afternoon. Thank you for joining our live stream today. I'm Melanie Boyer, the Manager of Digital Learning at Monticello, and I'll be moderating today's conversation. Our live stream today is a partnership with Monticello and Mount Vernon. We'll be talking today about horses and their role in early America. I'm joined here on site by my colleague Emilie Johnson, Associate Curator at Monticello, and we're joined virtually by Lisa Pregent, who is the Livestock Stable Manager at Mount Vernon. And today, both of our speakers will talk a little bit about early America and the role of horses in early America, and then we'll come back for a Q&A. So please leave your comments online, and we'll be answering those live at the end of the presentation. So now I'm going to turn it over to Emilie.
Thanks so much, Melanie, and welcome everybody. It's so great to be with you today. It's a beautiful afternoon here in Central Virginia, and I am standing on the site of our about 1809 stone stable. And what I should say is that the stable at Monticello is not a complete structure. In Jefferson's day, the two stone bays that are with me, you see one of them right here, was used for storing fodder, for storing tack, really as storage and workspaces. And there was a long L down behind my back, stretching a little bit down the hill. And that's where the actual bays for the horses, for Jefferson's blooded horses, and maybe some of the work horses that were kept here at Monticello, that's where they stayed when they weren't actually out on the roads. So what we have here was restored in 2016 and 2017, and this is where we're really able to talk about Jefferson and his lifelong love of horses and the important role that horses played here at Monticello. One of the memories about Jefferson and horses, his earliest memory, he is said to be going on horseback from Monticello, or from Shadwell, which is an adjacent plantation here, out to Tuckahoe, which is near Richmond. Jefferson's father was the executor of the estate at Tuckahoe when that plantation's owner died. And Jefferson is said to have a memory of being placed by an enslaved person on a pillow on horseback to make the trip from Monticello to near Richmond. Jefferson was a daily rider. He would ride to inspect the plantation, to check in to see how things were going. He rode for pleasure. He rode for therapy. After Jefferson's wife died in 1782, Jefferson was disconsolate. He was absolutely flattened by grief, and he is said to have gone riding. Just once he could leave the house, he's said to have gone riding, and he would go by himself. Every now and then he would take his daughter, Martha Jefferson, who became Martha Jefferson Randolph. She was about 10 years old at this time. He would take her with, as he started to heal, as he started to process through this grief, he would sometimes take her with him. But Jefferson rode almost daily up until the very end of his life, up until within about 3 weeks of his death in July 1826, Jefferson would ride. He called horses one of the best doctors out there and advocated a daily ride to keep healthy, to keep active, especially as he aged. Jefferson, thinking about distances, we're 150 or so, 100 miles from Washington, D.C. here. That trip in a carriage and on horseback, in a small carriage, not in a heavily laden wagon, that would take about 5 days to do. Montpelier, James Madison's home, which is about 35 miles away from here, that would have been a couple of hour trip. Even Charlottesville, which is off to this direction from us here, is about 3 or 4 miles away. If you're walking or trotting on a horse, that, depending on if you're walking or trotting, that could be about a half hour to an hour ride. So just to give you kind of a sense of where we are, and where the stable is located is really important, because right here we're really at the confluence of the system of roads that connected Monticello to the outside world. So the road kind of down behind me was the road that led out to Charlottesville, actually one of the closest springs. And those of you who know horses well know that horses need a lot of water a day, about 10 to 12 gallons is what I've read. The closest spring is about 1/8 of a mile down that way. And so hostlers and wagoneers were bringing barrels of water from that spring up to this space to keep Jefferson's horses watered. We are right at the edge of Mulberry Row. So this, of course, is the main plantation street with a lot of storehouses, craft workshops, the joiner's shop, the nailery, the blacksmith's forge, all along here. The main road up from the Rivanna River, the main road that connected us to Richmond, kind of comes up from behind me. So you see right here, we're really at an important transportation hub. This is kind of at the center. And I think it's easy to understand why Jefferson would have wanted his stable here. We think that there was a stable here, at least that appears in the documentary record, maybe as early as 1778. So Jefferson first really comes to the mountaintop in about 1769, about 9 years prior to that. He had the mountaintop leveled. He started construction on the places that he lived. He started construction on the main house. And like I said, in a document of 1778, there's an indication that a stable was located around here, but we don't know much about it. We don't know much about its size. We don't know much about its building materials. Probably made of wood. But that's about all we know. Then in the 1790s, we know a lot more. There's a wonderful document from 1796, which is an insurance plat, and Jefferson sketches out and describes buildings, and he describes a 5-bay, so a 5-part log structure in this location at the end of Mulberry Row that was intended for as his stable. It's named a stable. He gives us dimensions. Like, we know a good bit about this building. And then by 1806, there's another drawing of the property, and for some reason there's only 3 bays. So it's log construction. Log construction is temporary. Did 2 of the bays fall in? Did something happen? This is from 1796 to 1806. Jefferson isn't here very much. This is really the height of his political career between his stint as vice president and then his role as president. So what happened? In 1808, as Jefferson is starting to look towards his retirement after his presidency, he calls on workmen here at Monticello to get stone and to create the stone part of his stable, and then to build the wooden part that I described out. We don't know exactly how many stalls were located here. There's an overseer who, in a much later recollection, talks about that there were 36 stalls for horses at Monticello. And then Thomas Jefferson Randolph, who is Jefferson's grandson and kind of his legacy maker in a lot of ways, Randolph says, "Oh, Bacon, he's got an overactive imagination." He actually quite literally calls his imagination overactive, and says, no. There were never any more than about 15 stalls at Monticello at any one time. We know that there were a few places for horses up in the north wing, which is where Jefferson seems to have more likely kept his carriages. Those are labeled in a plat that they are places for visitors' horses. There's many people visiting Monticello. Most of them are coming on horseback, although there is a really, really snarky description of a visit in 1802 by Anna Maria Thornton, who is the wife of the architect William Thornton, who, because of the weather, because of a miscommunication, they're forced to walk up to Monticello. And it's September, and it's hot, and I believe it starts raining, and she's not impressed by a lot anyway, but she's really not impressed by her first approach to Monticello. Probably would have gone a lot better if she'd been on horseback. In any case, at any given time, we know people are keeping horses up closer to the house, but again, these are probably for more temporary visits. We believe that Jefferson's blooded horses probably stayed here, his horses for riding and his horses for carriage pulling. At any given point, with so many things with the past, we have snapshots. We have a horse's name. We have a list of work horses on the plantation and the various quarter farms here at Monticello. So at any given time, we think that Jefferson had 5 to 7 or so blooded horses. And when I say blooded horses, what am I talking about? Blooded horses are essentially what we think of today as thoroughbreds. These were often sired from imported English horses who maybe had connections to the horses that are seen as the starters of the thoroughbred breed. These are sort of your taller, lighter, faster horses. As we installed this exhibition, we couldn't put live animals on view for the public, but we wanted to give visitors a sense of an animal's movement, of their size. I grew up in a city. I didn't grow up immediately surrounded by horses. When someone says 16 hands, I don't really have a good sense of what that means. It actually means about there, about to the shoulder of the outline of the horse you see running. So when we were planning this exhibition, we installed these silhouettes of a blooded horse, which is right behind me, a mule with his long, prominent ears, and then a work horse, often called a Chickasaw or a Virginia horse, just to give people a little bit of a sense of how big these animals are, if you're not accustomed to living with them on a daily basis. So we know that Jefferson had about 5 to 7 at any given time, especially during the retirement. We know one of his carriages was typically pulled by a single horse, his phaeton. We know that his landau carriage, which is a carriage that he commissioned from John Hemmings and Joseph Fawcett and Burrell Colbert, who were all enslaved craftsmen here at Monticello, that carriage was built in about 1814, 1815, and that generally was pulled by either 2 or 4 horses. So that kind of helps us get a sense. And we know the names of those animals, which is really, really helpful as we start to try to put these together. We know how Jefferson drove. We know that Jefferson liked to drive himself in his phaeton. Isaac Granger Jefferson, who was an enslaved man here, he recorded his memories of his childhood at Monticello, and he made the comment that Jefferson would take the reins and drive himself fast, that Jefferson would drive really, really hard. And I believe that was in a smaller vehicle. When Jefferson is older and starts using the larger carriage, we know that there were young men who rode postilion on the horses that pulled that carriage. A young man named Israel Gillette talks about his role as a postilion. He worked alongside his brother. And if there were 4 horses, Israel says that he rode up on one of the front ones and his slightly older brother Gil rode towards the back. So you don't have, if you think about what we often think, sometimes what comes to mind when I think of a coach and a coachman is Cinderella, when you have the magically transformed pumpkin and the horse and the mice. You don't have anybody up in that role as, seated on a box coachman for Jefferson. You have these young men who are actually seated directly on the horses who are sort of leading them through the roadways. The roads in Virginia at this time were terrible, muddy, gutted, rough. So these men who were driving, and this is true for the men who were working with Jefferson on his carriages, this is true for the men who were driving wagons, bringing objects back and forth from the president's house, taking things back and forth down to Poplar Forest, which is about a 90-mile trip and takes about 3 days with a wagon. These men were ingenious engineers. They were master navigators. Roads weren't well marked. Like I said, they could be in terrible condition. You hear a lot about breaking an axle, breaking a wheel. So these men were often faced with having to do a pretty major structural fix on the road when they accidentally go through a rut in a road that just, cranks the axle and breaks the wheel open in some way, shape, or form. It's a real testimony. The fact that I can drive to Washington, D.C. in, give or take 2.5 hours these days, and you think about the travails that people went through to try to get from one place to another. It's really mind-boggling. What else can I tell you about Jefferson and riding? like I said, he was a daily rider, but he wasn't much of a racer. Jefferson really didn't, he attended horse races and he was clearly a fan, but Jefferson never really engaged in horse racing himself. His horses didn't tend to race. Oftentimes, actually, he would buy former racehorses after their careers were over. But he certainly attended races and enjoyed them. We know he attended horse races as well as carriage races. And he really, in terms of how he got horses, Jefferson did breed horses, especially when he was a young man. He seems to have been quite interested in breeding horses and in building up his stock in that way in the 1770s. The American Revolution really puts an end to that for Jefferson. When the British were in Virginia in 1780 and 1781, they were quite brutal they took horses, and Jefferson recorded that a lot of his horses were taken by the enemy. And it seems like that was a really heartbreaking episode for Jefferson to lose these horses to the British. And he never gets into breeding again. After that, he really gets his horses primarily by purchasing them. Generally 6 years old or so, adult horses. And with that, I think that I'm going to turn it over to Mount Vernon, and I'll look forward to answering your questions very soon.
Hi, thank you for being here with us today. My name is Lisa Pregent. I'm the livestock manager at George Washington's Mount Vernon. 2020 has marked my 25th year being employed by the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. And I've witnessed many changes around the estate, the most recent being the addition of this beautiful barn we're currently standing in. This is the Linda Mars Livestock Facility. It was completed in June of 2019 and was designed with many modern luxuries to meet the needs of our current livestock program. We'd like to think if George Washington was alive today, he'd have similar accommodations for his animals. You see, George Washington was an avid lover of horses, an animal that could be considered probably one of the most significant in the colonial era. They played a key role in the development of this country. Nearly everything in the 18th century involved horses. They were the main mode of transportation, either riding or pulling carriages. Let's say you wanted to go to Williamsburg or up to Philadelphia, or even to go visit your friends down the road. You'd either hop on a horse or into a carriage pulled by horses. Equines were also a huge part of the workforce on George Washington's 5 farms. They plowed, they harrowed, they cultivated fields. In 1792, George Washington built the 16-sided treading barn, a round barn he invented for treading his wheat. It was a 2-story structure. The horses were led up a ramp where the wheat was laid on the floorboards with 1.5-inch gaps. The horses would trot around, and the action of their hooves hitting the wheat would break that chaff from the straw, and it would fall to the bottom floor. It was then scooped up and taken to the grist mill. So you're cutting out a lot of labor, putting it onto the horses, and it's also a much more efficient way of doing it. Before the treading barn was built, threshing was done by laborers using a flail, which is basically 2 pieces of wood bound together by a piece of leather. And the laborers would literally beat the wheat out of the straw. So you're losing a lot of the product, to the mud. You'd have to pick it up out of the soil. So again, using horsepower to tread his wheat, which was his cash crop at the time. Horses were used for sport and for recreation. George Washington loved fox hunting. He tried to go as often as 3 times a week if his schedule allowed. His mount was usually blueskin, a horse described as a fine but fiery animal and of great endurance in the long run. He did own racehorses, most famously Magnolia, an Arabian stallion who raced in Alexandria, Virginia. His beloved war horses, Nelson and Blueskin, were both retired to pasture at Mount Vernon after the war. George Washington often took long walks around the estate in the evening, and it was said that when he would approach the field where Nelson was, the horse would run to the fence, neighing, excited to see his former rider. Thomas Jefferson referred to George Washington as one of the finest horsemen of his age and the most graceful figure that could be seen on horseback. George Washington maintained a stable of fine, well-kept horses throughout his life. From his fine-bred race horses to the drafty plow horses, he cared for his herd and actually personally checked on their condition. Washington entrusted the care of his herd to Peter Hardiman, an enslaved worker who oversaw the operations of the stables. Peter also directed other laborers who fed and groomed. They mucked stalls, cleaned saddles and harnesses. So today, bringing it into the current, Mount Vernon is home to 9 horses and 1 donkey. Every March through November, our livestock handlers take a step back in time when they get into colonial costume, and they're using our horses to bring George Washington's innovative farming techniques to the 21st century. At the Pioneer Farm site, we demonstrate George Washington's 7-year crop rotation. Horses plow and harrow the fields to prepare the soil for planting of crops such as wheat, oats, and corn. Ponies and horses pull a cultivator between rows of crops to break up the clumps, which allows the water and nutrients to reach the root of the plant. July through October, we have teams of ponies working in the treading barn, showing you how his wheat was treaded. Excuse me, I would like to introduce you actually to one of our current residents. Her name is Glory. She is a mammoth donkey. Let's see if I can get her to come over. She's a little shy sometimes. But she is here to represent the royal gift, the donkey that was gifted to George Washington by the King of Spain in 1785. She's going to be shy today. Excuse me, the Marquis de Lafayette also gifted Washington with another jack by the name of Knight of Malta. So with the addition of these 2 jacks, George Washington began breeding mules in America. A mule is a hybrid between a male donkey and a female horse. So that kind of gave Washington the nickname Father of the American Mule. It's interesting looking back at his farming inventories. In 1785, he had 132 horses and 0 mules on all 5 of his farms. In 1799, just months before his death, he had 27 horses, excuse me, 63 mules, and 20 donkeys. So as you can see, horses were such an important part of our history and certainly helped in the development of our country. We are not only grateful for their contributions made in war and in agriculture, but also for their current role in bringing our past to life. We certainly hope that you can come visit us at Mount Vernon, see our horses in action. Back to you, Monticello, for questions.
I think we put in the comments what a cool job you have, and we're all envious here. Thank you so much. So we have a couple questions, and I will just ask the questions, and I'll throw it either to Lisa or Emily. So to start out with, we have a question. What were some of the names of Jefferson's horses, Emily? Like, what were some of his favorite horses?
Sure. So Jefferson is known for 2 primary favorite horses, one from earlier in his life, one from towards the end of his life. His favorite horse of his youth was a horse named Caractacus, who was named for a Roman general. And Caractacus was foaled in 1775, and our last documentary record of him comes in about 1790. And then in about 1820 or so, Jefferson has his overseer, Edmund Bacon, by a horse named the Eagle. And the Eagle was Jefferson's horse of his old age. And there are some terrifying stories of Jefferson taking a terrible fall in the Rivanna River from the Eagle. And the Eagle was about 16 hands high. So that's about 64 inches or so to the shoulder. So I'm about 5'6". So we're talking about like right around here. He's really high up, and he falls from the Eagle, and he gets kind of caught on something and almost drowns, but then he was able to get free. Jefferson was 83 years old when this happened. So he's quite an old man as he's taking this pretty potentially catastrophic fall from this horse. And it's the eagle that Jefferson rode up until nearly his death. But the names of Jefferson's animals are really wonderful. They're named for Norse gods, a popular actress of the time, and actually Jefferson had a mule he named Dr. Slop. And Dr. Slop was a character in Lawrence Stern's Tristram Shandy, which was one of Jefferson's favorite novels. So it's a really wide range and kind of goes to the humorous at times too.
Thank you. Lisa, can we throw that question back to you? What were some of Washington's favorite horses, or names of some of the horses?
Washington's favorite horses? Nelson and Blueskin were his two favorite war horses. He preferred Nelson over Blueskin only because Nelson, he said, could handle the cannon fire a little bit better. Blueskin was a little more jumpy and didn't quite trust him as much. Excuse me. He had Magnolia, the Arabian racehorse. Prescott and Jackson were two of his chargers, his parade horses that he used.
Oh, cool. Okay, is she done talking? Okay. So another question, and Lisa, I'll let you answer this first, and then maybe we can throw it back to Emily. How did Washington get or acquire his horses?
A lot of them he either bought or traded. He did some breeding on the estates, but a lot of them, you could trade horses for land. He would trade horses, with other farmers. A lot of them, he would purchase. He did find one named Ranger. It came in on a boat. Ranger had a broken leg, and somebody acquired him, reset the leg, and then Washington actually purchased Ranger and was living on the estate.
Cool. And Emily?
Yeah, so like I said in my part of the presentation, Jefferson seemed to have been more interested in breeding horses earlier in his life, before the American Revolution. But after the Revolution, he almost consistently purchased horses. When he was in Philadelphia, he had his son-in-law go and talk to people here in Virginia to buy particular horses. Jefferson actually even bartered. Lisa mentioned that you could trade horses for land. Jefferson actually bartered a gold pocket watch with his nephew Samuel Carr for a horse in about 1813. But Jefferson was always on the lookout for horses, and he had, like I said, his son-in-laws, his overseer here at Monticello from 1806 to 1822. All of these guys were often deployed by Jefferson to go and try to buy animals.
Can you tell us, Emily, first about some of the enslaved people that might have helped out, taking care of horses here at Monticello?
Sure. So Jefferson's, again, there's sort of an early story and a later story. The man who was most responsible for caring for Jefferson's horses up until around 1800 was a man named Jupiter Evans. And Jupiter Evans and Jefferson were born in the same year. They were both born in 1743. And there's a really fascinating story that around Evans and horses that was retold by Jefferson's grandchildren. Jefferson ordered a couple of boys to go down to the post office and take a couple of carriage horses, and Jupiter absolutely refused to send them. And Jefferson ordered again, and Jupiter still refused. And so Jefferson called Evans in to meet with him, and basically was like, how dare you disobey me? I'm telling you to do this, you're not doing it. And Evans responds and he says, if you want the horses in the condition that you want your horses in, you're not going to send them to be ridden out by boys who don't know what they're doing. And Jefferson agreed. He eventually warned, and they say, Jefferson is known for being fairly mild-mannered. Apparently Jefferson was hot mad about this. Jefferson pulls back, though, and he eventually agrees, although he warns Evans not to refute him like that ever again. Later at Monticello, a man named Wormley Hughes, who was described by Edmund Bacon, the overseer, as remembering every detail, every size, every bit of information about every horse under his care, was primarily responsible for working with Jefferson's horses, for grooming them, for maintaining them. and then preparing them for Jefferson to ride.
Thank you. Lisa? Oh, hey, we had someone weigh in there. Lisa, I want to ask the question of you as well. Were there enslaved people that took care of Washington's horses? Or tell us any information you can about that.
Yes, Peter Hardiman was his, basically a stable manager. So he kind of oversaw the operations of the stable. And it's interesting, Peter was married to, and enslaved marriage wasn't recognized in Virginia during that time, but Washington did recognize it. But Peter was married to Caroline Branham, who was she was a housemaid, and they had, I believe, 6 children. And what's interesting is that Peter Hardiman's son followed in his father's footsteps and started working in the stables, and was actually he led Washington's funeral procession horse. So it's kind of neat to see, things come full circle.
Well, I do have an audience question here, so it actually is for either one of you or both of you. Did Washington and Jefferson ever talk about their horses with one another or exchange notes and ideas about caring for, selling, or breeding? Do we know?
Emilie, do you want to take that one?
Sure. I don't know. I imagine they did. I don't know of any documentation off the top of my head. Of course, Lisa, I do remember you're absolutely right in calling up Jefferson's comment about Washington and his skill as a horseman. I'm sure that they talked about horses. I'm sure that in their meetings, as a way, when you're sitting in a meeting and you talk about something maybe a little bit off the topic at hand, Jefferson certainly knew of Washington's great love and great skill with horses, and I'm sure that he would have wanted to speak with him on the topic.
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure either, but I would imagine there was communication going on between the two of them, but it's something that we can certainly research later.
Okay, well that's about all the questions we've got online here, but just for fun, Emilie, I'll throw this out to you first. How fast does a horse go?
Well, I admit, and Lisa probably knows this way better than I do based on real life activity, but all right, if you think about the Kentucky Derby, it's 1.25 miles, and they say what? It's the fastest 2 minutes in sports. So those horses, that's fast. When I looked it up, it said that what I read that like an average trot is about 8 miles an hour. So a really fast human runner could go about that. And what I've seen is that generally, if you're going a long distance, a trot is kind of where you would hang out, because it's a distance, it's a speed that the horse can maintain for a long period of time. And 8 miles an hour, that gets you going where you're going.
Yeah.
But Lisa, I would love to hear what you have to say about this.
It depends on the horse too. The thoroughbreds, like you were talking about on the racetrack, they can run, anywhere average 35, 40 miles an hour. You take a big draft horse, and they're not going to be moving quite that fast.
True.
But like Emilie was saying, if you're traveling far, you would keep, between a walk and a trot. A horse can carry a trot for a very long period of time. In doing some research, Washington said that he had traveled to Williamsburg, and it took him 3 days to get there, taking very few stops. So he didn't take many breaks, but he was able to make it to Williamsburg in 3 days.
Okay, so here's another one. Sorry, I lied. There's one more kind of fun one here. We had someone ask if it's possible to go to Monticello or Mount Vernon riding a horse nowadays. So maybe has there been anyone that's come up to either site riding a horse? Or could you do that nowadays? Lisa?
Well, I'm not sure, to be honest with you. We haven't had that happen. Doesn't mean that it ever won't.
I know we've staged some programs that have had people on horseback. And our president is an avid rider, as are quite a few of our staff members. But I don't know if we've ever had somebody like pop up 53 on horseback.
It'd be a little treacherous.
I guess someone could take the Saunders Monticello Trail on horseback and do it that way.
Yeah.
But I don't think we've seen it, and I'm afraid that I don't think we have any you know, places for horses to park or provisions for them should they come visit. So if anybody wants to visit Monticello on horseback, just let us know. And we'll, you know, give us a chance to make some preparations.
Well, thank you so much. I think that's all we have from the audience. I really appreciate Mount Vernon partnering with Monticello on this live stream. It's been a lot of fun. Thank you to Lisa Pregent for being there at the livestock stable. And also to Emilie, thank you so much for being here and talking with us today. We hope to see you all soon, either virtually or maybe in person. And thanks again. Have a great day.
Thank you.